Thanks, Stephen, and good evening, everyone. So this year has certainly been an incredibly momentous time period. And just to get our minds working, let's just spend a moment thinking about one word that you could use to summarise 2022. Maybe it doesn't have to be one word, but maybe a short phrase. How would you summarise the events that we've experienced throughout that time period? The one word that I came up with was uncertainty. Well, I guess we've had a few years that have been a little bit uncertain of recent time, so maybe we could change that to more uncertainty. So I think people were expecting that since COVID-19 had sort of been managed, as well as it could be, that things were going to get back to normal. But I guess you'd have to acknowledge that 2022 was not a normal year. There were many things that happened during that year which were completely different to what you might have expected. So really, I guess, when you look through some of these events that we've experienced, it almost looks like a tangled thread. It looks like it's difficult to know if there is a direction that the world is heading in. And definitely, if there is a direction, what is it? And that's exactly what we want to talk about tonight. Because there is certainty, and the Bible promises that it is able to be understood. But let's just go through a few of the events of 2022 to back up that idea that it was a year of incredible certainty. Now, at the top of the list, of course, is the war in Europe. And not only is it such a small border skirmish or anything of that nature, it is a war that is complete with things like nuclear threats and the like. So it is a threat, a conflict that has the potential to escalate, at least from a human perspective. There is obviously turmoil and changes in other areas as well. UK leadership, just to take one illustration. 3 different Prime Ministers in 2 months. That is a record and one that they're not terribly proud of. So we're seeing that this uncertainty is spreading throughout the European and even beyond those areas. Another illustration of exactly the same thing, Israeli elections. They were held again this year. I say again because they've had 5 elections in 4 years. And even after this sort of repetitive vote-taking process, they're still not really getting to any sort of consensus as to who should rule the country. When I say consensus, the ruling party has 25% of the votes. So you're sort of seeing there that it's a very small population, a small support base to actually support that result. And of course, the surprising thing was that Benjamin Netanyahu was actually the coalition leader that came back into power after being sort of ousted under fairly interesting circumstances. So you're seeing this uncertainty. In fact, the process of announcement of the election even illustrated this uncertainty. The opposition party, as it is now, actually announced that they'd won the election. And then they, somewhat embarrassingly, had to reverse that. And in the small hours of the morning after the further votes had been counted, the Likud party, which is obviously Benjamin Netanyahu's party, actually announced that they had won. Interesting enough, when you look at the results, they've both got 35 seats. So the only reason that Benjamin Netanyahu had won was because he was better at making coalitions than the other parties. So essentially, again, you can see that sort of uncertainty spreading even into the Middle East. Even in our era, even in our theatre, I should say, the Pacific area, conflict or potential conflict between China and Taiwan, again, certainly been ramped up quite a bit in 2022. And an illustration of a completely different type, we've said there the death of Queen Elizabeth, the longest reigning monarch, British monarch I should say, and her reign has come to an end. So all of these things have been illustrated and cited as being great causes of uncertainty. But as I said, the Bible promises that that's not a foregone conclusion. Even though we are experiencing those events, there is an alternative. And we're quoting here from 2 Peter chapter 1. And you can see that the illustration or the words that are used there is that we have a more sure word of prophecy. Sureness, certainty, the absolute opposite to uncertainty that we're observing. It says the biblical prophecies are able to give us that certainty which is sorely lacking in our world around us. But notice what it says next. Whereunto you do well that you take heed. So that actually implies there might be some people who are not going to listen, even though it does have the promise of this certainty that most people yearn for. And what impact is that going to have? If we take heed unto it, it's going to be like a light shining in a dark place, and like a dawn, like the dawn of a day. And the day star will arise in your hearts. And why can we be so certain? Well, it says, knowing this first, that no prophecy of the Scripture is of any private interpretation, for the prophecy came not in old time by the will of man, but holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. And so we get an indication there of the real source of certainty. Of course, it's God himself, and we'll investigate that further as we go through. So, let's just delve into some of these activities in a little more detail. And as we said, one of the major issues was the Russian military activity, or the special military operation, as the Russians insisted on calling it. No one mentioned that it's a war. And of course, even that has gone through some iterations. As we mentioned there, the first focus was on Kiev. They were aiming for basically a preemptive strike to take the capital of the nation and to make sure that they could install a leader that was friendly to the Russians. That obviously didn't happen. In fact, it's quite interesting to watch the circumstances that led to the failure of that particular military objective. Just go into it in a little bit of detail. Essentially what happened is that they tried, of course, to do an air assault, as I'm sure you would do. Not that I'm specialised in military areas, but obviously that's a lot easier than taking troops across land. So they flew some special ops troops into one of the major airports just next to Kiev. It's actually the Antonov Air Base, so for those of you that might be somewhat interested in aviation, you know about the Antonov aircraft. They are the biggest aircraft that have ever been manufactured. So that would have been an excellent base for the Russians to operate from. They could have brought in all their heavy equipment, brought in all their heavy transports, and that, of course, was the reason why they targeted that. However, it didn't work. Through a combination of some fairly gritty fighting and a few handy hints that the Ukrainians obtained from their allies, or at least from the international community, they were a little bit more prepared than the Russians expected them to be, and they were able to hold off those special forces so that they weren't able to take the airport, at least initially. And they actually pushed them into the trees around the airport, and they regrouped and came back, and the Russians ended up taking the airport. But by that stage, the airport was so damaged by the fighting that had happened, it was actually totally useless for them in terms of landing heavy military equipment. So you can see it was only sort of a matter of hours that determined the difference between that being entirely successful and obviously there being a very serious threat to the existence of Ukraine. So obviously the problems, the difficulties they experienced kept on mounting. They clearly had some difficulties around international reaction. So there was international condemnation of the fact that Russia had invaded Ukraine. And of course that also led to sanctions, which again was quite surprising. Even experts in the area stated that the level of sanctions that the international community was able to muster in a short period of time was unique. It never had been done before. And I guess the international community has had a little bit of experience of recent time about sanctions, but this set of sanctions was quite remarkable. So that caused quite a bit of difficulty for the Russians at home, as well as, of course, their military intentions. The problems kept on mounting as well. As we mentioned there, they had quite a bit of challenges on a logistical front, getting their military equipment and keeping it stocked with fuel and all those sorts of supplies. Ammunition was quite a challenge. And so eventually they discarded the option of taking Kiev, and they retreated back, and they essentially decided that they were going to focus on the eastern section of Ukraine. And of course the eastern section of the Ukraine is the area where most of the Russian speakers are, and there are even some so-called separatist regions there which had already expressed sort of intentions to become part of Russia. So that was obviously a lot easier battle. So complete change of strategy there when they encountered these difficulties. And then a really significant event happened, and that is the international community changed from just verbal support for the Ukrainians to actually supplying military equipment. There was obviously a fairly delicate dance there around how much military equipment they gave them and the capability of that military equipment, but they were providing them with some pretty substantial firepower in particular. And that is generally recognised as one of the major turning points, or the reasons for the turning points in the Ukraine conflict. So, faced with some challenges and some potential that they might be losing ground, what do the Russians do? They actually attempt to consolidate their victories, so-called, by running referendum. And so they basically were asking these eastern regions whether they wanted to join Russia or not. And not surprisingly, the answer came out to be that they did. Now, the international community didn't take too much notice of that. There was a fairly good pattern of behaviour from the Russians around sort of making sure the results of those types of things go in their favour. So there wasn't much value placed on that or importance placed on it. However, the Russians have now got this theoretical position, at least, that these areas belong to Russia. In fact, one of the comments that the Russians made was that these areas, the Donbass in particular, will be Russia's forever. And they had to eat those words fairly quickly. And then the tide turned, as we said, due to the fact that there was these military equipment being flown in, the tide turned and the Ukrainians actually started taking territory back. And that was quite a significant challenge to the Russians. And as we say there, their response was actually to mobilise further troops. Allegedly, some 300,000 troops were called up, and that caused all sorts of problems at a domestic level. You probably saw the pictures of queues of cars at border checkings. Not people coming into Russia, but people trying to get out, and people not wanting to be part of this compulsory call-up. So again, it seems like every turn that Russia takes, they encounter a new problem. Every solution that they potentially create for their problems creates another problem for them to deal with. So that's a brief summary of what we've seen in terms of Russia's activity around the Ukraine. But as we said, the important thing that we need to understand here is what is the Bible's interpretation or the Bible's view, the certain view that we've already said, about Russia. And in order to answer that question, we're going to refer to Ezekiel 38. Now, you might have read Ezekiel 38 tonight and noticed that there is no mention of Russia there, or at least in the version that we read. But it is well acknowledged by authorities, a number of authorities, that this chapter is very clearly speaking about the Russians. Now let's demonstrate that to start with. We're not going to go through a detailed exposition of Ezekiel 38. We're just going to touch on it to the extent that it explains some of the events that we're seeing this year. So, verse 2, Son of man, set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. The point to be made about that verse is that the chief prince of Meshech is actually a slight mistranslation. The word chief should actually be translated as Rosh. Rosh has the idea of chief. So really all that's happened here is there's been a confusion between a proper noun and a not so proper noun, just a normal sort of descriptor. So effectively what they're saying is it's just someone's name. And the question then of course is, Rosh, who does that refer to? Well, there is plenty of evidence, and I've only just cited two of them there. It's certainly not an exhaustive list. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that this is the Russians. In fact, just a very anecdotal sort of illustration. I'm not sure if you can see the sort of inscription on the bottom of that tank. It's Russia, actually, in Cyrillic script. And if you look at the first part of that, it's Ros. So the P letter in Cyrillic script has an R sound, and you go forward from there, it's actually Rossia, is how they pronounce it in Russian. But putting that aside, that's fairly circumstantial evidence. But let's talk about this from a more authoritative perspective. We refer there to Gesenius. Now, Gesenius is actually a very well-respected lexicographer. So that means he's very well experienced with words and usage. And he says quite clearly, in fact, he says, undoubtedly the Russians. So in his view, absolutely no question that this word, Rosh, is talking with the Russians. And in fact, that comment, undoubtedly the Russians, is taken from Gesenius's commentary about Ezekiel 38. He's not just talking generally about the word Rosh, he's actually saying this word in this occurrence is undoubtedly referring to the Russians. So that's just one point of reference for you. As I say, there are more. The other reference I note there is George Verdansky. So we're moving away from sort of relatively ancient, shall I say. Gesenius obviously wrote several hundred years ago. George Verdansky is actually a well-recognised modern, I say modern, we're talking late 1800s, early 1900s, historian of Russia. And he goes and traces back a lot of the history of Russia, back to the Scythians, etc. And he is recognised as a very substantial authority, even amongst the Russians themselves. In fact, if you went to high school in Russia, you would learn history from George Verdansky. So George Verdansky is like sort of the textbook that you would use when you're learning Russian history in Russian high school. So he, again, is clear in identifying that Rosh is a early descriptor of the Russians. So this Gog that the prophecy is aimed against, so God says, set your face against Gog. We're told that he's of the land of Magog, and he is Rosh of Meshech. So essentially, we're clearly identifying there that this group of nations is actually the Russians. Now, the next thing that we're told from Ezekiel 38 is that they are actually not just acting on their own, it's actually the head of a confederacy of nations. You might have actually gathered that even from verse 2 as we read it, but Magog and Meshech and Tubal are again all references to that area. We won't go into detail. It can be done, definitely. There is support for that. Magog is actually covering the area of Ukraine to some extent, and Meshech and Tubal is the area of Moskva and Tubolsky, areas currently covered by the nation of Russia. But even further than that, as we said, if we refer to verse 5 and 6, there are more nations that are mentioned, and these ones really need no interpretation. So we have Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya. And then in verse 6, there's mentioned Gomer and Togarmah. So as we said, quite a list of nations there. Now all of these obviously are the ancient names for these places. So I thought it was easiest just to illustrate that on a map. Again, there is support that can be provided for this, but you're seeing that this confederacy of nations actually takes up a significant portion of real estate. So they basically take up a lot of that European and into the Russian territory, so into Asia. And even, of course, some nations there, Libya and Ethiopia, which, of course, are in the Middle East. Togarmah, which is referred to, obviously, is the Turkish area. And that, of course, is an area that has been bubbling along during this year, and there's interesting developments there that we won't have time to talk about. But just to come back and take a few more observations from Ezekiel 38. What do? What does this great confederacy of nations actually achieve? Well, in verse 8, as you can see there, they invade the land of Israel. Of course, that is quite a clear reference. So it says, after many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into a land that is brought back from the sword. Now, if it left it there, we would have grounds to question exactly what they were talking about. There's been a few nations, of course, that have been brought back from the sword. Not too many, but there's been a few. However, it then says, and gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel. So no need to sort of guess at what this nation is. They're coming down onto the mountains of Israel. Interesting enough, the other thing that is quite clear here is that there seems to be a bit of an economic motivation to this conflict. So in verse 12, we have this comment that they would come down to take a spoil and to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places. You might think, well, Why would you want to invade desolate places? That's not terribly helpful. Well, they were desolate places, but now they are inhabited, and upon a people that are gathered out of the nations, which have gotten them cattle and goods, and that dwell in the midst of the land. So, economic element is actually quite interesting, because if you look at some of the things that Russia did as part of the Ukrainian invasion, looting and sort of getting as much economic value from those activities was a significant part of it. They obviously capitalised, if that's the right word, on the massive grain exports that Ukraine is famous for. Ukraine is the 4th largest grain exporter in the world. So when Russia came down, they basically stole, for want of a better word, a lot of that and restricted a lot more. So Russia itself is very into wheat. It's a large wheat producer. Ukraine has wheat as well as other things, but by actually attacking the supply through Ukraine, it actually boosted the price of wheat, which obviously Russia could take advantage of. So you can see there's sort of a little bit of background, I guess, or a track record for the Russians when it comes to economic motivations. Now, you think, well, surely if something like this happens, if there's a massive international confederacy that invades the nation of Israel, surely there'll be some sort of response, just like we've seen with Ukraine. This emphasis on territorial integrity, the fact that they've invaded a sovereign nation. Well, does that happen? Well, you can see a little bit of that. So in verse 13, it says, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, this group of nations, art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, and to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil? Again, notice there's a reference to the economic element to this dispute. So there is opposition. And again, we won't go through those, but Tarshish, Sheba and Dedan. Tarshish can be quite well proven to be Britain. In fact, I'd have to say that it is easier to prove that Tarshish is Britain today than it was in any time in history. Recent archaeological discoveries, together with some advances in metallurgy, have really produced some very strong proof that when the Bible talks about Tarshish, it is actually talking about the British power. And again, we see a little bit of an echo here. Or in fact, this will end up being an echo of something we've seen in 2022. Britain was actually one of the most strident voices against the invasion of Ukraine. In fact, one of the Russian commentators called Boris Johnson, the then PM of the UK, the most anti-Russian leader of the UK. So earned himself a bit of notoriety there, but essentially it was probably for good reason. He was fairly verbose in condemning the actions of Russia. So you can see here that some of the things that we're observing, that Russia's pattern of behaviour is the same. Now, we're not saying that what Russia did is actually fulfilment of Ezekiel 38. Obviously, Ukraine is not the nation of Israel. But you can sort of see Russia behaving in a way that the Bible predicts it will, and perhaps to a larger extent, of course, in the future. And this adds to the reasonableness of what the Bible predicts about what is going to happen. Now, the other Bible prediction, which it's very important for us to bring to bear here, is actually found in Daniel chapter 11. Now, Daniel chapter 11 is, I would suggest to you, a prophecy of exactly the same time period. But we're not going to go through the detail of it. However, let's just read a section of Daniel chapter 11, and we can just notice some similarities between that and some of the things that we have learnt about in Ezekiel 38. So Daniel chapter 11 is an incredibly detailed prophecy of a very wide-ranging period of history. However, we're just going to focus on the latter part. So we're going to read from verse 40 onwards, essentially to the end of the chapter. And I want you to just be alert to any repetition of ideas that we've already heard in Ezekiel 38. And at the time of the end, shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. And he shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. But tidings out of the north, out of the east and out of the north, shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth, and with great fury to destroy and to utterly make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacle of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. What similarities did you pick up between that description and the one we've already read? I've listed out a few. It's probably not even an exhaustive list. But at the very part there, at the very first verse we read, it talks about the time of the end. What was the equivalent term in Ezekiel 38? In the latter days, except that that's got a similar connotation to it. It talks about the king of the north. Now that's interesting from two perspectives. Number one, you might remember in Ezekiel 38 it talks about them coming out of the north quarters, the north parts. And secondarily, it refers to this idea of a king. Now that's quite interesting, particularly in our current environment. It's quite rare. Quite rare to have a kingdom. There's certainly none, I guess Thailand is still a kingdom, but there's very few of them around the world, at least of recent time. So, at least in where they have a capacity to instigate military activity as well. So we're getting an idea, a bit of a feel for the type of rulership. How is that similar to Ezekiel 38? What was he called? He was called a prince. So you get the same sort of idea, a chief. Many people. So basically you've got many people that have come down. And of course there's a massive conglomeration of people that are described in Ezekiel 38. They're spoken of as well-equipped, and that was also a descriptor in Ezekiel 38. A little bit of a contrast to what we've seen at present. Libya and Ethiopia are mentioned specifically as part of the Confederacy, and they are again specifically mentioned here in Daniel chapter 11. Again, there's more than one repetition of the idea of financial motives for this invasion. And of course, the destination, the location for this particular conflict is again suggested to be Israel. Now, you might say, well, hang on, Daniel chapter 11 didn't refer to the word Israel. It's not as clear as Ezekiel 38. Well, that may well be true, but there are some pretty strong indications. So a couple of things to observe. Verse 41 talks about the nations that will actually avoid the conflagration as this king of the north comes down and attacks this area. And it says Edom, Moab, and the children of Ammon. Now, they are all nations surrounding Israel. So you're getting an indication that this conflict is going to be somewhere in the Middle East. And then, of course, the next verse, verse 42, talks about Egypt. So it says Egypt will not escape. All the nations that are sort of perhaps a little bit to the east of Israel do escape. Implication is, which one actually captures the brunt of their aggression? It's going to be Israel. However, it's a little bit more specific than that. You'll notice a couple of references in Daniel chapter 11 that talks about the glorious land, or in fact, in verse 45, I should say, it talks about the glorious holy mountains. So if we were to ask anyone, what is referred to as the Holy Land? I think many of us would conclude that this is indicative of Israel. But what about the glorious land? Is this a terminology that's used frequently throughout Scripture? Is this clearly identifiable as Israel? Well, that term, the glorious land, in so many words, is only used in Daniel chapter 11, but there is a very interesting and similar phrase to that in Ezekiel. So going back into Ezekiel, not chapter 38 in this case, this is actually Ezekiel chapter 20, and it actually says that the nation of Israel is the glory of all lands. So it's basically saying if you're looking for an exemplar, an illustration of a glorious land, then Israel is the greatest illustration of all countries. So the terminology that's used here, the glorious land, is very appropriate if we agree that it applies to Israel. So you can see here this invasion actually comes up for discussion in both Ezekiel and in Daniel. So I hope you agree that it's fair to say that this is talking about the same event. The other point to also note here is that if you do a detailed study of what is meant by the King of the North, the King of the South, you'll actually come to the same conclusion. So we're not suggesting this outside of context. The context of these prophecies support that conclusion as well. Now, this actually places an interesting complexion on the invasion of Ukraine that we've observed this year. There has, of course, been some questions about what was the real motivation for Israel to go and invade Ukraine. Ostensibly, when it was discussed with the international community, there was this suggestion that Russia was concerned about NATO expansion. So they were concerned that Ukraine was getting a bit too friendly with the NATO bloc of countries, and therefore they decided to take action. Now that's, I guess, reasonable at one level, but it certainly hasn't achieved the outcome. So Ukraine now is probably even more determined to take that pathway. Plus, they've also lost the Scandinavian nations who have rapidly applied for NATO membership. So now they've ended up with double the problem, essentially, that they might have previously had. Now the question is, would Russia have actually envisaged that? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know what was sort of going on there. But there is, I guess, at least some suggestion that there might have been more to it. That might have been one of the reasons, but perhaps not the only reason. And it has been suggested by some commentators that perhaps it was actually the protection of their Crimea area and assets that was really the focus, or at least an additional focus for this invasion. Now, as you know, brief history, whilst Ukraine was tied up with some tricky internal politics in 2014, Russia came down and quietly annexed Crimea. So this was a far different affair. There was basically unidentified troops that wore no insignia, that suddenly sort of arrived on the border between Crimea and Ukraine proper, and after a few months they basically declared that they were now taking over. In fact, again, they had one of these referendum that Russia has been using of recent time. In fact, it was within 10 days of invading, they stepped up and said, we're going to have this referendum about whether Crimea actually wants to be part of Russia. In fact, the choices on the ballot was, do you want to be a separate state or do you want to become part of Russia? There was no option 3 about staying part of Ukraine. So even that was sort of a little bit foregone conclusion there. And apparently, the results that they announced, they said there was 80% participation by the Crimean Peninsula, the population there, and they said 97% of the population decided that they wanted to join Russia, allegedly. A few months after that, there was actually some correction issued. In fact, there was some leaked material, and it suggested that the participation rate was actually 30%, and it was only sort of just over half of the people in Crimea that actually wanted to be part of Russia. So an often cited fact with this issue here is the fact that there are a substantial amount of ethnic Russians in Crimea. It runs at about 60%. And that's fair enough, but just because you're an ethnic Russian doesn't necessarily mean that you want to be part of Russia. And of course, when push came to shove and they tested it with these referendum, it really didn't sort of stack up so well. And in fact, as you can tell, even in 2014, it was fairly borderline, even if you accept the referendum as a representative sample. And since then, things have actually become quite tough for the people that have stayed in Crimea. Now, why is this a problem? Why would Russia, number one, take this step, and why would they actually want to make sure they could retain control over the Crimean Peninsula? Well, as you probably appreciate, that is Russia's access to the Black Sea and therefore into the Mediterranean. Now, why is that so interesting from a biblical perspective? Well, as we refer back to Daniel chapter 11 in verse 40, you remember one of the particular modes of transport that was mentioned there was that he came with many ships. Now, Russia moving many ships would be practically impossible for a large part of the year unless they have a warm water port. And of course, Sevastopol, which is where the Black Sea Fleet is stationed and has been since the time of the Tsars, is obviously on that Crimean Peninsula. And Russia seems to be taking some of these actions to make sure that they can support that military asset. And in fact, quite interestingly, even since this invasion has happened, they have taken the opportunity to basically change the population of Crimea. So what they did was they made sure that anyone that sympathised with Ukraine was thoroughly unwelcome there, and there has been a lot of people that have been fleeing that area. And secondarily, they actually brought in, it's been estimated, up to 1 million Russians. Obviously very much connected to the military base there, so there's a lot of military personnel, but a lot more than that. So the population of Crimea itself is only 2.5 million people to start off with. So they've had this massive displacement. Obviously those favourable to Ukraine have been forced out, and then there's been this influx of those that are pro-Russian. So they have taken up quite determined steps to ensure they continue that foothold in Crimea. Now, I'm not making any predictions about whether Crimea will be retaken. The Ukrainians, of course, are making a very bold stance on that particular issue and saying that they will take that area, and they're not going to be satisfied until Russia is totally removed from their country. But we'll wait and see. I've even seen some military experts saying, why would Ukraine even want to take Crimea now? It's so pro-Russian that it would just be a massive headache for them to administer. So that's another thought to work through, and again, another area where we can see this congruency between what the Bible predicts and the actions of Russia as we've seen in 2022. Now, to be honest though, we do need to be quite clear about the current state of the war. It's not going very well for Russia. There's even some suggestions that there could be a complete and outright Ukrainian victory. And of course, the suggestion has also been made that, well, Russia has copped such a hammering through this process, it really means that any future conflicts are out of the question. But what I wanted to do is not make any definitive predictions, but just subject that assumption to a little bit of critical assessment. If you go back through history, there are quite a few significant illustrations where wars have not led to peace, but they've actually led to more conflicts. And one that's very appropriate in this sort of European theatre is Germany. If you know the sort of background to the First and Second World War, it was actually the consequences of the First World War that almost forced Germany to take up arms in the Second World War. At least that's how Hitler saw it anyway. So this idea that the fact that Russia is defeated means that we're not going to have any further battles, unfortunately, that might be very nice if that does happen, but the Bible is predicting that there will be a conflict, and even when you look at it from recent history, there is good suggestion that that can happen quite quickly. The other thing to note there is that financial motivation that we spoke about before obviously makes a lot of sense if Russia is substantially depleted by the invasion that they've undertaken in Ukraine. So they will need replenishment. We notice there that they obviously have a lot of equipment when they come down in this predicted invasion. So where do they get that from? They'll obviously need substantial resources. And of course, their position as an economy has been substantially affected. Russia's economy is about the size of Italy's economy, that is. So it's not a huge economy in the overall scheme of things. And of course, since sanctions and since their military expeditions, it's dropped substantially. They're estimating around about 10% for starters, and it will go down from there. So you can understand why there might be a suggestion that the only way that they can actually recoup those losses and sort of rectify their financial standing is by military activity. Plus, it's interesting, as we've seen, when you combine Daniel 11 and Ezekiel 38, the two countries that they seem to be focused on are Israel and Egypt. Now, something that's emerged from this whole process is Israel and Egypt are the two main competitors for Russian markets. I won't say they're the only competitors, but they are a significant competitor. Russia sells about 150 billion cubic metres of gas into Europe. Israel is willing to supply about 20 billion cubic metres of that gas. So it can't take over where Russia left off, but it's a decent customer that Israel has actually obtained because of Russia's actions. So that's the other issue. And finally, the other point that needs to be made is Daniel chapter 11 verse 40 starts off by saying the king of the south, we won't go into who that is, but some other nation pushes at the king of the north, and it's a provocation that actually causes Russia to come down. And the language is quite forcible. It talks about putting hooks in your jaws, which is a very brutal illustration of what some of the ancient nations used to do to their captives. So basically it's suggesting that Russia may be actually quite unwilling to come down, but they're forced to due to circumstances outside their control. Now, when you read in Daniel chapter 11, you think the king of the south shall push at him. In the English, of course, push can be anything from a sort of gentle nudge to something a little bit more dangerous. But in the Hebrew, that's quite a significant attack. It's actually the word that's used for a bull goring someone. So there is some indication that there's going to be a significant provocation, a significant damage to Russia in order to provoke it to take this step. So obviously the events of 2022 can show how that type of thing can happen quite easily. Now, the other thing that we observe from all of these events is the general uncertainty of war. I'm sure there'd be a few people around Red Square that would agree with that particular conclusion for 2022. Everyone, when it first started, thought that Russia would completely wipe the slate when it came to Ukraine. But it didn't happen. And it shows that until actually conflict arises, it's very difficult to determine the outcome. And this is where we actually come back to that analogy that we started with, where history might look like a tangled thread. But what the Bible allows us to do is it actually allows us to see a golden thread that actually goes through that somewhat tangled mess, as it might appear to us, and we can see that there is some certainty amongst all this chaos. And I just wanted to illustrate a couple of different steps. This is by no means comprehensive, but if you go through some of the wars that have happened of recent time, there does seem to be one particular nation which seems to always benefit or get a fairly certain outcome from these conflicts. So World War I, just think back, or maybe think back to your history lessons at least, about World War I. What caused World War I and why was it fought? Well, I'm sure you're probably thinking of Archduke Ferdinand, the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and basically it was to do with Serbian independence. So a nationalistic Serb actually assassinated this Archduke because they wanted independence. And as a consequence, obviously the Austro-Hungarians weren't terribly happy with that, and they all gathered their allies and they basically created this conflict. The question is, did that war achieve that objective? Did Serbia end up coming out of that as an independent nation? Well, definitely not. As you probably know, Serbia had to experience a lot more horrific experiences under Tito's Yugoslavia before they actually got their independence. Strictly, they were only separately independent in 2006. So World War I did not achieve the objective for which it was allegedly started. But what did it achieve? Well, one thing it achieved was the destruction, or the very much reduction, of the Ottoman Empire. And in particular, it achieved the liberation of the area of Palestine. Fast forward to World War II. World War II, obviously, as we've already mentioned, arose because of some of the injustices, as the Germans perceived it, in relation to how they've been treated on the world stage. And a decent element of that whole behaviour was an idea that they could come up with a better race, an idea that they were actually being subjected to unfair treatment, whereas the reality was that the Germans were actually a superior race. And that also involved identification of inferior races, and the Jews were in that category. So one significant element of World War II was the implementation of the so-called final solution and the destruction of the Jews throughout Europe and beyond where they had opportunity. Did World War II achieve that objective? Well, in fact, that one is incredibly clear because, if anything, it achieved the exact opposite. The international community, shamed, I guess, by what had happened, when the war ended, actually quite quickly thereafter voted in favour at the United Nations for the creation of the Israeli state. So we can see here that these conflicts, albeit uncertain, seem to be sort of drawing a few dots in a line here when it comes to the destiny of the nation of Israel. And of course, we could go through all the Israeli wars, and I won't do that because I know you went through that last week, but they are incredible outcomes. Just a brief comment on those ones. The military academy at West Point, you might be familiar with that, the US academy where they teach people how to fight or battle strategy, they refuse to study any of the Israeli wars. The conclusion of their military experts is that the outcome of those wars are just too unusual to actually gain any useful learning from them. So that's the world's interpretation, the military experts, that's the world's perspective on those Israeli wars. Remarkable outcomes when the odds were very much against them. And even the current Ukraine conflict, Israel is benefiting from it. As we said, they've got a great new customer when it comes to gas. And they've joined up with the Egyptians to liquefy their natural gas reserves and to send that into Europe. So, not that is a terribly significant thing when it's measured against all these other issues. So when you look through the Bible, you'll find constant references to the national existence of the nation of Israel in the latter days. In fact, Ezekiel 38 obviously implies that that's happened. Obviously, it's been invaded, Israel, the mountains of Israel are being invaded. It's at a time when they're populated by this great confederacy of nations. And these are the sorts of things that we're seeing happen. However, there are a few glitches on the, horizon for Israel. Not everything's okay with Israel. And of course, I refer there to Iran's position. And we won't go through that in detail, but I'm sure we're quite well aware of the high degree of opposition between Iran and Israel. Iran denies Israel's right to exist. In fact, there was a headline in the Tehran Times, and they basically produced this map, which basically said, these are all the places in Israel which we can bomb if there's just one wrong move from Israel. And in fact, this whole issue has become even more problematic of recent time, actually probably due to the Ukraine conflict. There does tend to be a fairly strong pattern in international politics. When the world is occupied with a conflict in one area, unscrupulous parties, if that's their ilk, actually take advantage of that and sort of make moves to advance their own agenda. North Korea is a classic example of that sort of behaviour. And there was fear that Iran would do the same thing. Jerusalem Post earlier this year produced an article basically saying we're concerned that Tehran will take advantage of the focus of the world on Ukraine. But even though there has been a lot of focus on the Iranian nuclear program and some of the controls, like the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which USA is sort of struggling to get back into currency, they've been taken away. And so you might naturally think, well, this is really dangerous for Israel. Well, as you know, there have been some really interesting developments in Iran. And basically, it's completely redirected the attention of the Iranian authorities away from nuclear programs, etc. So this internal revolution has really picked up steam. I won't go through the details there, but a couple of things just to note. The events that we are seeing in Iran today are an interesting echo of the events that led to the Iranian Revolution in 1979. So the Iranian Revolution started with some strikes, and the strikes basically really crippled the economy, and as a consequence they said they further sort of created the problems for the then Tsar of Iran. Another one also is that there has been this focus on the personal cost, as we see there, that they're basically saying there's over 500 people now that have died. The Iranians put it at a much lower number. But interesting enough, there was a particular event that killed 400 people just before the Iranian Revolution. It was the massacre of the Rex Cinema, if you want to look it up. Basically, there was a whole stack of people that were unfortunately incinerated, and it was suggested that this was the work of the Tsar, and as a consequence, the Shah, and as a consequence, that was really the turning point, and that's why people really started to get behind these strikes. So I think the Iranian populace, or at least the leaders, might be being quite concerned about those echoes. So again, we're seeing that an area that might be quite dangerous for Israel, actually just due to one event, the mistreatment of one girl, 22-year-old girl. Suddenly, there's a big issue that the Iranians have to deal with. So, what does all this mean? So hopefully you've seen that with the results, with the biblical prophecies that we've seen, there is good indication to suggest that the Bible actually predicts the things that we're going to experience in the near future. And of course, the Bible has historically predicted quite a number of events, not the least of which, of course, is the creation of the nation of Israel. So the question that we need to leave ourselves with tonight is, do we believe that? I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but faith and belief is actually something that's debated quite a bit in our current sort of secular society. And some people say, oh, well, faith is sort of either blind faith, where there's no evidence, or it's evidence-based faith. And people say, well, I'm of this particular persuasion, you're of that particular persuasion. And in fact, interesting enough, if you go back to 2 Peter, where we started tonight, faith is a very key theme of that chapter. So that surety which God offers for those people that truly understand his prophecies is actually only useful if you have that faith. It basically says if you want that enlightenment, if you want that illumination which Peter speaks about, you need to accept these things with faith. But what's the answer? Should we be looking for evidence-based faith, or should we just have this blind faith, as it's called by the skeptics? Well, the reality is that there is plenty of evidence in the Bible that can support our faith. But the key point to note there is evidence-based faith only gives you faith in things that leave evidence. You can't have evidence-based faith about things that are yet to happen in the future. You can't have evidence-based faith about things that are going to be far greater than we have ever experienced. And the reality is that's what the Bible promises. So I think the answer there is, and the challenge that we're left with tonight, is we can use the Bible and the prophecies contained in the Bible to develop our faith based on the evidence of the past. But we should then extrapolate that out and say, well, this is a reliable book. And most importantly, the God of the Bible that made those predictions is a reliable God. And that will give us the confidence to have faith that doesn't have any evidence. But I'm not saying that's blind faith. I'm actually saying that this is the way in which we get true faith. Faith in the things that the Bible promises. Things that are even beyond our experience. And this is a fundamental axiom of the Bible. The Bible does not say that our experiences are just going to continue as they are. It promises something far greater than what we can ever even imagine. And that's where this faith, this sight, this illumination, which Peter talks about, is so valuable. We would love, of course, to talk with you further about the things that we believe give us that certainty and the things that the Bible has predicted for our future.